Boarding pass to hubris. Yes, yes, close the deal. Thornton Industries is practically printing money over here. David bellowed into his phone, his voice echoing through the first-class boarding area. He navigated the narrow aisle with all the grace of a bull in a china shop, bumping shoulders and muttering cursory apologies without breaking his stride or lowering his voice. Ilara Rodriguez, a flight attendant with 10 years of experience, expertly sidestepped him. A quick glance told her everything she needed to know: tailored suit that was a little too tight, hair slicked back with enough product to withstand a hurricane, and a gold watch, probably a Rolex, that practically screamed for attention. Another peacock trying to preen his way into significance. He finally wrestled his oversized, monogrammed luggage into the overhead compartment, grunting with the effort. Honestly, you'd think they'd make these things bigger, he complained to no one in particular. He tugged his designer scarf, silk, naturally tighter around his neck as if bracing himself against the sheer ordinariness of the plane. He slumped into his plush, first-class seat with a sigh of exaggerated relief. Finally, he declared, pulling out his phone again. Now, about that bonus structure. Ilara approached him with a carefully cultivated smile. Welcome aboard, Mr. Thornton. May I offer you something to drink? He waved a dismissive hand. Champagne. The good stuff. And make it snappy. I've got important things to discuss. He resumed his phone call, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still perfectly audible to everyone within a 5-row radius. Ilara, used to all sorts of passenger behaviors, simply raised an eyebrow and headed to the galley. She poured a generous flute of Dom Perignon, its effervescence mirroring the man's inflated ego, and returned to his seat. Here you are, sir, she said, placing the champagne on his tray table. He barely glanced at her. Took you long enough? He took a long gulp of the champagne, then returned to his call. Look, I don't care if Jenkins is threatening to quit. We're Thornton Industries. He's replaceable. Ilara moved down the aisle, assisting other passengers, but she couldn't help but overhear snippets of his conversation. Boasting about profits, dismissing employees, name-dropping influential clients. It was a symphony of self-importance played at full volume. As the plane taxied towards the runway, David finally ended his call with a triumphant "Thornton Industries always wins." He leaned back in his seat, a smug expression plastered on his face. He caught Ilara's eye and winked. Now that's what I call a productive start to a transatlantic flight. Ilara offered a polite, but noncommittal, smile. She had a feeling this flight to London was going to be anything but smooth. The generic man. David smoothed the lapel of his bespoke suit, catching his reflection in the glass. Beside him sat a cipher. A catalog of commonplace, charcoal suit, unremarkable shoes, a tie whispering anonymity. Some corporate cog, no doubt en route to a tedious London conference. A silent chuckle rumbled in David's chest. He was on his way to broker a deal of staggering proportions, a deal to further entrench his position among the city's power players. This nonentity probably booked his budget flight months ago. He manufactured a cough. Rather subdued attire for an overseas flight, wouldn't you say? He ventured, dripping with false cordiality. The man pivoted slowly, his expression a blank canvas. His eyes, however, were like chips of flint, coolly calculating. Is it? He rumbled, the sound resonating with unexpected depth. David inflated his ego along with his chest, interpreting the lack of pushback as capitulation. One ought to cultivate a presence, don't you think? Especially when traversing continents. Initial impressions are paramount, after all. He indicated the man's clothes with a dismissive flick of his perfectly groomed hand. Something with a bit more panache, perhaps? A vibrant accent? Let the world know you embrace boldness. A ghost of a smile played on the man's lips. Taking sartorial risks? A rather tame pursuit, wouldn't you agree? David's blood prickled. Tame? The insolence. There's a strategy to it, my friend. It's about broadcasting assurance dominance. Concepts that may be foreign to you. He leaned back, luxuriating in his assumed superiority. The man simply stared forward, jaw set hard. David was riding high, unstoppable. Say, when you're in town, visit my tailor. I'll have them kit you out in something memorable. He chuckled, savoring his own cleverness. The man finally turned, his gaze unwavering and direct. I appreciate the sentiment, he offered, his voice still even, almost bored. But I believe I'll manage with what I have. He extracted a dog-eared paperback from his briefcase and immersed himself in its pages, effectively relegating David to oblivion. David simmered. To be ignored, particularly after such a masterful display of social maneuvering, was galling. With a theatrical flourish, he opened his laptop, summoning a spreadsheet teeming with intricate financial data. He canted the screen subtly, ensuring the impressive figures were within the man's line of sight. He would demonstrate his worth. He would impress them all. Champagne and bravado. Another bottle, darling. David boomed, snapping his fingers at Alara. The first bottle of Laurent Perrier had vanished alarmingly quickly, and the second was following suit. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, and his voice had acquired a slurring edge. Don't want our esteemed guest, now do we, to think we're skimping on the good stuff. Statham merely raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement playing around his lips. He hadn't touched his own glass in quite some time. So, Statham, David continued, his voice dripping with false camaraderie. Tell me, what exactly do you do? Besides sit there looking all stoic. He punctuated the question with a loud, wet laugh. I keep busy, Statham replied, his tone even, his gaze fixed on the clouds swirling outside the window. David snorted. Busy doing what? Counting your wrinkles? You look like you could use a good punch. Toughen you up a bit. He puffed out his chest, flexing his surprisingly flabby biceps. I used to box, you know. Golden gloves. Before I got successful. Alara, refilling David's glass, caught Statham's eye. There was a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. A warning, perhaps? She squeezed his hand very briefly, hoping to convey her concern. What about you, Statham? You ever thrown a punch in your life? I bet you spend your time in libraries and art galleries. David's voice was rising again, probably faint at the sight of a little blood. He leaned closer, invading Statham's personal space. I bet I could take you right here, right now. One hand tied behind my back. Statham finally turned, his gaze meeting David's directly. I'm sure you think you could, he said, his voice dangerously soft. Think? I know I could, David insisted, emboldened by the champagne and the lack of any visible reaction from his target. He gestured wildly. This is me, right? Bam. One punch. You're down. Out cold. And this. He mimed a kick. This is for being such a stuck-up. He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the appropriate insult. Alara cleared her throat. Sir, perhaps you should try to relax. We're still several hours from London. She reached for the champagne bottle, hoping to discreetly remove it. David batted her hand away. Relax? I am relaxed. Just having a bit of fun. Aren't we, Statham? Don't you try and mother me, love. I'm a paying customer. He winked at Statham, completely missing the steel in the other man's eyes. Right, Statham? A bit of harmless fun. Turbulence and terror. The first lurch came without warning, tossing David Thornton against the plush leather of his seat. Champagne sloshed over the rim of his glass, staining his tailored suit. He sputtered, more annoyed than alarmed. Bloody hell, he muttered, reaching for a napkin. Then the floor dropped out from under them. A collective gasp filled the cabin as the plane bucked violently. The seatbelt sign flashed on with a jarring clang. David's earlier annoyance morphed into genuine fear as the aircraft shuddered again, harder this time, the overhead lights flickering ominously. Across the aisle, Jason Statham remained unnervingly calm. He hadn't even spilled his water. His eyes, however, narrowed slightly as he scanned the cabin, taking in the rising panic. A high-pitched scream pierced the air. David, momentarily distracted from his own terror, glanced back. A small boy, no older than 6, stood frozen in the aisle, pointing upwards, his face contorted in fear. Alara Rodriguez, the flight attendant, usually a picture of composed professionalism, struggled to maintain her balance, her face pale. She was halfway down the aisle, barking instructions for everyone to buckle up, but her voice was lost in the roar of the wind buffeting the plane. Another, even more violent jolt ripped through the aircraft. This time, the overhead compartments surrendered. Metal latches gave way with a sickening groan and luggage rained down. Briefcases, garment bags, and duty-free shopping tumbled into the aisle, adding to the chaos. The boy screamed again, louder, more desperate. Above him, a particularly large and battered suitcase teetered precariously, its straps straining. David, momentarily paralyzed by fear, could only watch in horror as the suitcase broke free, plummeting towards the child. Before David could even think to shout a warning, Jason was out of his seat. He moved with a speed that defied his relaxed demeanor, a blur of controlled motion. He lunged forward, intercepting the falling suitcase with a grunt. The impact knocked him sideways, but he held firm, shielding the boy. The suitcase landed with a dull thud against his shoulder, inches from the child's head. Alara, finally reaching them, scooped the boy into her arms, her voice trembling as she reassured him. Jason, rubbing his shoulder, gave the boy a reassuring nod, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. The turbulence, though still present, seemed to lessen slightly, the worst of it apparently over. David Thornton, his face ashen, stared at Jason with a newfound expression, something that might have been awe mixed with a definite dose of shame. The hero's reflex. David Thornton was still stewing. The audacity of the man, Jason, whatever his name was. Cutting in line like that. The carry-on the size of a small car. Now, fumbling with the overhead bin like a complete amateur. David huffed, adjusting his tie. He'd worked hard to afford this first-class upgrade, and this disruption was entirely unwelcome. Then, the world seemed to shift into slow motion. He saw it all unfold with horrifying clarity. The oversized suitcase finally dislodged, tumbling end over end from the bin. A small child, no older than 4, toddling into the aisle, oblivious to the danger. David's brain stalled, caught between the instinct to shout a warning and the paralyzing shock of the impending disaster. But Jason didn't hesitate. It was a blur. One moment he was leaning against the seat, apparently unconcerned. The next, he was a human comet, a streak of motion that defied comprehension. He moved with a speed David hadn't thought possible, a fluid grace that belied his imposing frame. There was no wasted motion, no frantic scrambling. Just pure, distilled action. David watched, mouth agape, as Jason intercepted the suitcase mere inches from the child's head. The force of the catch was staggering. David could practically feel the air displacement as Jason absorbed the impact, his muscles bulging beneath his tailored suit. The suitcase, a behemoth of leather and metal, crumpled slightly in his grip. Silence hung heavy in the cabin for a heartbeat. Then, the child's parents, who had been fussing with their own luggage, realized what had almost happened. The mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The father rushed forward, scooping the child into his arms, his face a mask of terror and relief. "Oh my God, are you all right? Are you hurt?" the mother stammered, her voice trembling. She turned to Jason, her eyes wide with gratitude. You saved him. You saved our son." The father, still clutching his child, nodded vigorously. We can't thank you enough. That could have been terrible." He looked at Jason with a newfound respect, a stark contrast to the earlier annoyance David had witnessed. Jason, unfazed, simply shrugged. "Just a reflex," he said, his voice calm and even. He righted the suitcase, hefted it effortlessly back into the overhead bin, and then resumed his position, leaning against the seat as if nothing extraordinary had happened. David stared. "Just a reflex?" He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat a mixture of shame and disbelief. Recognition and regret. The screech of tearing metal echoed in David's ears, momentarily eclipsing the frantic cries around him. Then he saw him. Statham. Not just some balding, gruff-voiced bloke, but Jason Statham, the action star, the guy who'd just ripped open an overhead compartment door like it was made of paper. Statham, calm amidst the chaos, was handing a terrified little boy to a flight attendant. The boy, no older than 7, clung to him, sobbing. Statham gently patted his back, murmuring something David couldn't hear over the din, but the gesture radiated reassurance. David's face drained of color. Recognition slammed into him with the force of a rogue wave. That sneer, that quiet confidence, the way he moved with lethal grace, it was all there, plastered across countless movie screens, now illuminated in the harsh, flickering cabin lights. His mind reeled, replaying his earlier insults in a sickening loop. "Lack of legroom, mate? You look a bit rough, pal. Think you're too important for basic manners?" Each phrase echoed with amplified stupidity. He'd been lecturing Jason Statham on airplane etiquette. The irony was a physical blow. Around him, a nervous energy crackled. Alara, her face pale but resolute, was directing passengers towards the emergency exits, her voice trembling slightly. She caught David's eye, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze. He looked away, shame burning in his cheeks. A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. "Is that Statham? Jason Statham? He's amazing." Heads turned, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Camera phones flicked on, furtively capturing the scene. David wanted to disappear. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The audacity of his earlier behavior, the sheer ignorance, was mortifying. He treated a genuine hero like an inconvenience. He watched as Statham, having ensured the boy was safe, began assisting other passengers. He moved with focused efficiency, his movements economical and precise. There was no bravado, no posing for the cameras, just quiet competence. Regret gnawed at David. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was something deeper, a profound sense of having misjudged someone, of having let his own petty insecurities cloud his judgment. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the sheer weight of his foolishness. He was just another face in the crowd now, swallowed by the collective awe and gratitude. And he was a face consumed with guilt. A lesson in humility. David swallowed, the lump in his throat feeling like a golf ball. He hadn't moved since the oxygen masks retracted with a soft hiss. Statham was calmly readjusting his tie, seemingly unfazed. The little boy, now maskless and clinging to his mother, was the only evidence of the near disaster. David felt a burning shame creeping up his neck. He finally managed to croak out, Mr. Statham, I owe you an apology. I had no idea." Statham raised a hand, stopping David's stammering mid-sentence. His eyes, the color of aged whiskey, held no anger, only a weary knowing. "Don't," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the tense quiet of the cabin. "Just remember this, never judge a book by its cover, Mr. Thornton." The words hung in the air, simple yet profound. David flinched, the truth of them a sharp sting. He wanted to disappear, to rewind the last hour and erase his arrogant assumptions. He mumbled, "I understand," but the words felt hollow, inadequate. Ilara Rodriguez, her face pale but her voice steady, began moving down the aisle, checking on passengers. She paused by David, offering a strained smile. "Are you all right, Mr. Thornton?" He nodded, avoiding her gaze. He saw pity in her eyes and something else, disappointment. He deserved it. The rest of the flight was an exercise in excruciating public humiliation. Whispers followed him. Glances, sharp and condemning, pierced his skin. He could hear snippets of conversations, unbelievable, the nerve. And could have cost that little boy his life. He shrunk into his seat, pulling his cashmere blanket tighter around himself as if it could shield him from the collective disapproval of the entire first-class cabin. Even the soft hum of the engines seemed to mock him. He tried to distract himself with the in-flight magazine, but the glossy images of exotic destinations and smiling families only amplified his misery. He was trapped, suspended thousands of feet in the air with nothing but his own colossal stupidity for company. The complimentary champagne remained untouched in its flute, the bubbles mocking his sour mood. He deserved this discomfort, this ostracization. He had earned it. A noticed descent. Statham unfolded himself from his seat, a palpable serenity radiating outward, a stark contrast to the lingering tension clinging to the cabin after the mid-air ordeal. He smoothed his jacket, offered a muted, almost regretful glance toward the boy's parents, then proceeded with understated command toward the exit. Flanking the doorway stood two men in charcoal suits, faces carved from stone. Their eyes swept the area, professional and alert, yet their stance conveyed respect. Guardians, no doubt, deployed to safeguard him. David remained slumped, the aircraft's recycled air suddenly oppressive. He felt diminished, a speck of dust caught in a draft. The earlier swagger, that irritating sense of superiority, had vanished, leaving a bitter aftertaste of self-reproach. He'd been useless, paralyzed, while Statham had acted decisively. Down on the tarmac, a small assembly had gathered, mobile phones thrust skyward. The digital shutters clicked and whirred, a distinct sound even through the thick glass. Statham paused, a fleeting smile gracing his lips. A brief, almost hesitant wave acknowledged the crowd, then he vanished into the throng, engulfed by flashes and awed whispers. David sank further into his seat. The disparity stung. He could already imagine the headlines, the hagiographic accounts, the inevitable memes. Statham, the rescuer. And him? An asterisk, if that. A hushed anecdote amongst the select few who'd witnessed his dismal performance. He lingered until the cabin was nearly deserted before releasing his seatbelt. The overhead bins were mostly empty, littered with travel debris, crumpled tissues, a discarded in-flight magazine, a solitary earbud abandoned like a forgotten thought. He hoisted his carry-on, the leather suddenly feeling flimsy and inadequate in his hand. The terminal was a kaleidoscope of faces, a babel of tongues. People surged past, their attention fixed on distant goals. No one noticed him. No one cared. He was just another nameless face, dissolving into the background hum. At baggage claim, the carousel lurched and groaned, disgorging a jumbled mass of luggage. He spotted his own, a scuffed brown duffel, making its solitary rounds. He hauled it off the belt, its weight feeling disproportionate, a leaden echo of his shattered pride. As he trudged toward the exit, he couldn't escape the sensation that he was descending, not just from the aircraft, but into a deeper, darker place of his own making. A changed man? The recycled air tasted metallic, a bitter tang clinging to David's tongue. Outside the porthole window, clouds sprawled like a vast, uncaring dreamscape. Each jolt of the aircraft mirrored the turmoil within, the toxic brew of guilt and self-loathing that had kept him awake all night. The memory reel played on repeat, Statham's unwavering gaze, the passenger's wide-eyed terror, the cold gleam of the weapon under the cabin lights. His reflection offered a disturbing portrait, a stranger with bruised shadows under his eyes. Could that hollow-eyed man truly be him, the preening peacock who'd strutted through first class, dispensing scorn like a poorly chosen aftershave? The acid sting of his callous words, the dismissive flick of his wrist, the recollection brought a wave of nausea. How easily he'd condemned, how readily he'd assumed superiority. His whole identity felt like a house of cards built on the shaky foundation of other people's perceived shortcomings. He winced, remembering the flight attendant's tight-lipped smile as he'd griped about the glitchy entertainment system. He cringed at the thought of the woman beside him, her suppressed irritation palpable as he'd barked into his phone. He'd treated them all as impediments, mere obstacles in his frantic climb toward, what? A slightly more exclusive vintage? The magnitude of his past behavior, amplified by Statham's courageous selflessness, slammed into him like a rogue wave. Obsessed with curating an image of success, he neglected the fundamentals of basic decency. The irony twisted the knife, so preoccupied with flaunting his supposed advantages, he'd completely missed the authentic article, the fortitude, the grace, the genuine metal standing within arm's reach. A muffled groan escaped his throat. He shielded his face, the smooth band of his timepiece pressing uncomfortably into his skin. This was more than simple shame, it was a deep, gut-wrenching remorse. He had to recalibrate. He needed to become something different. As the plane tilted earthward, David made a silent pledge, an oath whispered into the sanitized atmosphere. He would cultivate awareness, nurture compassion. He would listen rather than lecture, encourage instead of tearing down. He would strive to recognize the inherent dignity in everyone he encountered, irrespective of their station or circumstance. He would, in essence, strive to be worthy. Statham's image, bold against the canvas of catastrophe, would serve as a constant touchstone, a stark reminder of the man he should have been and the man he yearned to become. Whether he could truly achieve that transformation remained to be seen, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, David discerned a fragile spark of hope amidst the wreckage of his former arrogance. The path ahead would undoubtedly be arduous, but it was a path he was finally prepared to tread.